Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome again to Syriana Analysis. I'm your host, Kerouac Almasian. Today, I'm discussing the announcement of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to participate in the upcoming presidential elections in the United States. For those who don't know, Robert F. Kennedy is the son of the former U.S. Senator Robert F. Kennedy and the nephew of President John F. Kennedy, who was the last good president, American president, in my opinion, in the modern times, and he was assassinated by maybe we're not even allowed to discuss this case on YouTube because they are labeling channels as spreading misinformation and propaganda, etc., etc. And last week, or 10 days ago, they deleted 5 of my videos. And since then, the reach of my channel has decreased. So if you want to help me again to reach more people, please share this video with your friends. So he announced that he's going to participate in the elections in 2024 alongside Marianne. Marianne is her name is Marianne Williamson. Um, so this is the chart that we have now. For now, this is from the New York Times. For now, we know that Robert F. Kennedy will run alongside Marianne Williamson and most probably Joe Biden. And I really don't know why the Democrats are still pushing for Joe Biden. On the other hand, we have 4 Republican candidates for now: Donald Trump, Nikki Haley, Vivek Ramaswamy, and Asa Hutchinson. To be honest with you, I know Donald Trump, I know Nikki Haley, I know Joe Biden, and I know Robert F. Kennedy. The rest 3, I'm not sure about them. I watched a video of Vivek Ramaswamy the other day on Twitter, and I was like, I found a really hard time. Who is more warmonger? Is it Joe Biden or Vivek Ramaswamy? He appeared to me a very neocon hawk. Nikki Haley is the same. Donald Trump, he pretended in the last presidential elections that he was anti-war. Yes, he didn't start a new war, but there were so many occasions he was able to pursue better foreign policy, and he didn't, and especially in Syria. So I want you here on the right side to read this text, how the New York Times portrayed Robert F. Kennedy in comparison to other candidates, for example. They say Robert F. Kennedy Jr. announced a presidential campaign on Wednesday built on relitigating COVID-19 shutdowns and shaking Americans' faith in science. I mean, this is very, very 2020 approach. This is like in 2020, if you call someone that is questioning the vaccines or questioning the lockdowns, they would say you're crazy. But now in 2023, everybody knows that the lockdowns were counterproductive and they had more psychological effects on the people, and they ruined the people's well-being, both their psychological health and also physical health, in addition to their economic welfare or well-being in overall. So if also the vaccines that they told us in 2020 that it stops infection, it stops transmission, it turned out not to be true. And we have now a big data that shows that even if you get your vaccine, you will contract the disease and also you will pass the disease. So this is something that we don't have to speak about it anymore. So Robert F. Kennedy Jr. in 2022, he was raising these questions and doubts about the vaccines, and all these outlets were funded by the big pharma or Bill Gates, and they were pushing the propaganda in order to for financial reasons, basically. And this has happened on the expense of the people's well-being. Now here Primo, Radical Primo, he says, wow, nice objective reporting from the Free Press, very unbiased. I mean, there are here at least 6 candidates and they were just focusing on Robert F. Kennedy and trying to smear him. But even their tactics, and as I mentioned this a few times, it's a 2020 tactic. Yeah, they're very strong, but they're not creative. So they're just repeating the same propaganda from 2020 against now Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And I think this pushback by the media against Robert F. Kennedy Jr. will only give him more credibility among the people who already question the mainstream narratives and mainstream media. So they're really giving him a service now. They're really helping him by such a really, really bad and biased reporting. And I'm not endorsing Robert F. Kennedy Jr. I have learned my lesson that not to endorse any politician, especially the American presidents. I'm not an American. I'm just saying that I learned my lesson not to endorse or support verbally or anything any American president, because the person who is a candidate is different when a person becomes a president. And we all know that there are so many corporations, so many influential people in the United States, in the military industrial complex, in the CIA, in the Pentagon, in the Wall Street, in the banks, in the social media platforms, etc. So these people have enormous influence over the decision making in the United States. Therefore, even if the president has good ideas and he wants to implement some of them, there is a huge bureaucracy and difficulty for him to or her to pursue his vision. So this was from the New York Times. I want to share with you what Robert F. Kennedy Jr. said when he announced his candidacy. It's interesting, in my opinion. So, first of all, he says that Ukraine is not in the U.S. national interest, and secondly, says our national interest is not to bring Russia and China closer to each other. Let's take a look first, this part.
Is this war in the U.S. national interest? We just need to isolate that question. Is it in the U.S. national interest? And there are, some of the leading pangerms of most respected people of our national diplomats, let's say Henry Kissinger, Jack Matlock, Larry Wilkinson, who's Colin Powell's chief of staff. They all have said definitively, if you just want to ask, is it in our national interest? It is not. It is not in America's national interest to push Russia closer to China. That is a cataclysm. Number two, it's not in our national interest to do something that could involve us in a nuclear exchange with a country that has more nuclear weapons than us.
So I definitely agree with him that it's not in the US interest to be at war with a nuclear power such as Russia that has more nuclear weapons than the United States. It's not about the quantity, but it's about the effectiveness of these weapons, right? But is Ukraine in the national interest of the United States? This is the question. So if from the American point of view, we have to take two perspectives. The perspective of the national interest of the United States, which, in my opinion, is not in Ukraine. The national interest of the United States is to improve the livelihood of the Americans, is to build a country and infrastructure in the United States that competes with the rest of the world. So here comes this theory or the narrative or the theory of isolationism. So the United States shouldn't engage in the global affairs, should build its own country. This is the national interest of the United States: education, healthcare system, roads, infrastructure, electricity, poverty, homelessness, etc., etc. This is the national interest of the United States, if you want to speak completely in an honest way. But in the United States, we have a big warmongering, psychopathic elites or cabal, and they have bigger interest, financial interest, and their interest, they cannot stay in a position of power, rule the world, and subjugate the rest of the world and loot the rest of the world if they're not in a position of hegemon. So we have these two perspectives. One is in my opinion, and the American perspective. Yes, they don't have any national interest in Ukraine. And the second thing is these interests of the cabals and these criminals who, yes, they would say, yeah, we have an interest in Ukraine because it serves them, not the Americans. It serves them because if this empire, the American empire, is engaging in wars and hostilities with the rest of the world or in different parts of the world and bringing any good to its people, I would respect that more. I would say at least they're serving their people, but they're not even doing that. They're serving only themselves. So what he says here is very important. And the national interest of the United States is not in Ukraine, and not in Syria, and not in Iraq, and not in Libya, and not in Somalia, and not in Taiwan. It's in the United States. It's there. And this policy of bulldogging against Russia in Ukraine, it's just bringing Russia and China closer together. And this is what Brzezinski warned against. And there's so many geopolitical minds in the United States, they're warning against this policy, that the biggest catastrophe for the United States is when China and Russia become closer together. And this is happening right now. Let's continue.
But we need to know as Americans, and we have a right to know, what is our government's chief objective in this war? Now, we were told initially that the objective was humanitarian. And that is a good reason to be there, a humanitarian. And what that means is trying to end the bloodshed and minimize it as much as possible. But in recent times, President Biden said that one of our objectives, at least, is regime change of Vladimir Putin. And this is the same strategy that did not work well for us in Iraq. And it's many of the same people who are around the neocons, who are around President Biden, who have been talking about that for a long time and have been engaged in geopolitical machinations in the Ukraine since 2014. And then President Biden's Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, validated President Biden's statement by saying that our objective in the Ukraine is to exhaust and degrade the Russian army so they're incapable of having battles anywhere else in the world. Now, and indeed, many of the steps that we've taken in the Ukraine have seemed to indicate that our interest is in prolonging the war rather than shortening it. So if those are our objectives, to have regime change and exhaust the Russians, that is completely antithetical to a humanitarian mission. If it's
This is so correct on so many levels. If the objective of the United States is humanitarian, they should pursue diplomacy now. Now, just right now. There are tens of thousands of Ukrainians, both in the military and civilians, they perished in the last 1 year. And they have been used as pawns against the Russian forces. This is for them. It's just it's if they have a chessboard, it's just one stone on the chessboard, and they're just moving it against Russia. This is how the rulers in the United States see this conflict in Ukraine. So if their objective is humanitarian, they have to fly now. Antony Blinken, he has to go to Moscow and bring Zelensky and Putin on a negotiation table. If they don't like the Chinese proposal, let them present their own diplomatic proposal in this regard. But they won't do that. They won't do that. They vote the entire European continent as one bloc and push them against Russia. They Ukraine, Georgia, and they're trying to do it with Armenia now. This is crazy what these American decision makers are doing. And in my opinion, the real objective is, yes, it's a regime change. If the Russians didn't intervene now, and I'm not giving any justification, if you see it from the Russian perspective, they invaded and launched this military operation because they know that Ukraine will become a NATO country, and if it becomes a NATO country, it will be on the doorstep of Russia, and then the Americans will have the chance to project their power and hegemony within the Russian domestic affairs, and they will be able to destabilize Russia from within. And that was, and there are some Russians, by the way, say like. Praise your God and thank your God that it's Putin and not Medvedev or any other person in power. They believe that Putin's decision to wage this military operation in Ukraine came too late, and they say if any other Russian president was in power, other hawk, probably this would have been way more earlier. I'm not sure about that. I'm just sharing with you what I read sometimes on Twitter by Russian accounts. Now, the second video also from John F. Kennedy, and he says loud applause when Robert F. Kennedy cited his uncle, John F. Kennedy, vowing to, quote, take the CIA and shatter it into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. He said that, in my opinion, not in my opinion, he said that in 1961, because John F. Kennedy, he was lied to by the CIA during the Bay of Pigs, which was in April 1961, when around 1,400 exiled Cubans invaded southern coast of Cuba, backed by the CIA to do a regime change to remove Castro from power. So he mentions this, and he says that his uncle vowed to take the CIA and shatter it into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. And what happened to his uncle? hmm Now you know.
And my uncle came into office 2 months later. He was fighting his intelligence apparatus and his military because they wanted to invade. They wanted to do the Bay of Pigs. He was totally against it, and he let them roll over him. And in the middle of the Bay of Pigs, he realized they were lying to him, and he realized the function of the intelligence agencies had become to provide the military-industrial complex with a constant pipeline of war. And he came out during the middle of the night during the Bay of Pigs catastrophe, and he said, I want to take the CIA. Alan Dulles had lied to him, Charles Cabell, Richard Bissell, Louis Lemitzer, Curtis LeMay had all lied to him through their teeth. And he said, I want to take the CIA and shatter it into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds.
Wow. So he said he basically challenged the CIA and their approach with him and how they lied to him in regards to the Bay of Pigs, which was a CIA operation to remove Castro. And also remember, John F. Kennedy, he wanted to also withdraw the U.S. forces from its military bases abroad, and especially in Vietnam. And the CIA and the Pentagon were against it. So we have to dig in more. I'm not an expert on this assassination case, but there is a good documentary if you guys want to watch for Oliver Stone, JFK Revisited, I think the name of the documentary. But if you Google it, simply Oliver Stone and JFK documentary, you will find it. I think you can watch it for $2-3 on YouTube. It's paid, but it's worth watching. Now he comes to another lie that the CIA again told to another American president, which led into another catastrophic consequences, which was Iraq. Take a look.
And George W. Bush had the same problem. George W. Bush says the worst mistake he made as president was listening to CIA Director George Tenet tell him it was a slam dunk that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. And so the neocons and CIA got to go into Iraq and throw out and do regime change. And we got now we've spent $8 trillion. And what do we get for that $8 trillion? Nothing. Worse than nothing. Iraq is now much worse off than it was when we went in there. We killed more Iraqis than Saddam Hussein ever did. We may have killed 1 million Iraqis. Nobody knows the number. It is an incoherent country today with where Shia death squads are fighting with Sunni death squads in the street. The government is corrupt. The police are corrupt. We created ISIS. We drove 2 million refugees up into Europe. They destabilized democracy for a generation in Europe. They caused Brexit. This is the cost of the Iraq war. $8 trillion there, $16 trillion for the lockdowns, $24 trillion, nothing to show except a devastated middle class in the United States of America, and we need to put an end to that.
Look, he mentions here that George W. Bush has been lied to by the director of the CIA, and that is true. And George W. Bush, even if you remember when he was speaking about the war in Ukraine, and he said the decision of one man to wage an unjustified war against, he wanted to say Ukraine, and he said Iraq. And it was a slippery slope, right? And then he said, yeah, Iraq too. He knows deep inside George W. Bush that his decision was wrong. And he knows that he has been lied to. And he knows there are so many blood on his hands now with this. And he knows that this has led to the rise of ISIS. And also, this was just the beginning of the war against Syria. Why I'm calling him always John. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. should also know that the war in Iraq was the beginning of the war in Syria. And the emergence of ISIS in Syria was also one of the consequences of the US foreign policy in the Middle East. Therefore, the refugee crisis that happened in Iraq, from Iraq and Syria to Europe, they received millions of refugees. It was due to the American policy. All these people, they were happily living in their own countries. I haven't seen people like walking and marching with hundreds of thousands of people through the Balkan countries to Western Europe in order to reach to Germany, Netherlands, France, etc., etc. This only happened after the war, the invasion of Iraq, and after the regime change war on Syria. So we have to really put this in the proper context.
Our entire strategy in the Mideast has utterly collapsed, and our economy is going to follow if we don't do something fast. And I'm going to bring the troops home, and I'm going to close the bases, and I'm going to start investing in the United States middle class in our country, and I'm going to make us an exemplary democracy again.
So this is very, very interesting, in my opinion, and the media really was unfair with Robert F. Kennedy. And as I mentioned, I'm not defending him, but they were really unfair and unjust, and um, it's quite clear that they don't like him. And it's not about the journalists, right? It's about the people behind these media outlets. They don't like him. And one of the people who hosted him and gave him time to speak his mind is Tucker Carlson. And Tucker gave him the time, 5 minutes, to formulate his opinions. The first 4 minutes, he's repeating himself what he already said during the speech of the candidacy. And I just want you to listen what he said about Ukraine and how much casualties they have here.
But the question is, why are we in the Ukraine? Because Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense, said that we're there to exhaust the Russians. President Biden has said that we're there to deplatform, to depose Vladimir Putin. And if that's why we're there, and we're killing a lot of Ukrainians as pawns in a proxy war between two great powers. Here's one last thing I would say. Nobody talks about this. There's 14,000 Ukrainian civilians who have died, but 300,000 troops. The Russians are killing Ukrainians at a 7-to-1 to 8-to-1 ratio. They cannot sustain this. What we're being told about this war.
Yep, it's just untrue. 14,000 civilians, over 300,000 soldiers or militants fighting alongside the Ukrainian army, they perished. Over 300,000 people in 1 year. And there are still people who say, Slava Ukraini, they will win this war. They are sure about that. And those are just armchair experts. They're pushing these people into death. Into death. They don't even care about it because they hate Russia so much that they want to see Russia destroyed on its knees. The only time they were happy in the past decades when the Soviet Union collapsed, and this era between 1990 and 2000 before Putin took power. This was the golden era for these people. When they saw poverty in Russia, and they saw the economy crumbling, and when they saw hunger, and when they saw lots of women, they were forced to go and work in prostitution and all this stuff that happened because people were dying from hunger. This is when they were happy. This is what they want. This is the status that they want to see the Russians are living in. This is the conditions they want to see in Russia. And I'm sure about that. They are so much racist. They're really racist against the Russians. And we can see that clearly now after the Ukraine war. So they don't care how many Ukrainians die as long as they prolong this war, because their strategy is to drain the Russian economy and the Russian army, and it backfired. You can see it clearly. Brazil president now is even criticizing the United States and Europe, and they were really happy to see Lula come back. They thought he will be on their side, and now Lula is making good relations with China and dealing in yuan, and also with Russia. Russia and China, they're having really strategic relationships. They're reshaping the entire economic system in the world, the banking system. They're supporting the BRICS bank. So it's crazy. It's crazy, really, how they treat the Ukrainians, and they really come and claim that they care about Ukrainians. And now see how the Huffington Post covered the Robert F. Kennedy's candidacy. Tucker Carlson embraces anti-vaxxer Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s campaign for president. How can someone be so dishonest? Ron Dick, in my opinion. Tucker Carlson praised a Democrat running for president on Wednesday, the extreme anti vaxxer Robert F. Kennedy Jr. The right wing Fox News host had Kennedy on his show and gushed over him as if he were a hardline Republican. Kennedy's presence on Fox News, a prominent sower of vaccine doubt, is no shocker. He blasted the coronavirus vaccine, found to be safe and effective in preventing hospitalization and deaths. And sometimes I truly laugh when they really put links, that you have to go and see the source of it. It's like, you claim that these vaccines work and you will be immune from the disease, and you weren't. And you claim that you will not give others the virus and transmit it to others, and it turned out to be untrue. And now you say it's safe and effective against hospitalization and death. But what about the adverse reactions and the people having adverse reactions? Why don't you mention that in this article? He got his Instagram account suspended for repeatedly sharing debunked claims about the coronavirus or vaccines. I mean, imagine thinking that Instagram is a scientific magazine or something, and they suspended Robert F. Kennedy because he was spreading misinformation about the vaccine. It's the fucking FBI telling the Instagram and Facebook what is true and what is wrong. By the way, Facebook now labels the last article of Seymour Hersh about dealing with the enemies, and how, like, the title is dealing with the enemies, and how Zelensky is allegedly or reportedly embezzled 400 million euros from the financial help that he receives. It's now labeled as misinformation and false information on Facebook. So how can you fucking trust these outlets? It's like they're giving him credibility by deplatforming him. So they even here smear him for promoting ivermectin, which again, proven to be a safe medicine. But who am I to know, right? So this is very unfair coverage, in my opinion. But if I want to summarize the, let's say, the campaign of Robert F. Kennedy Jr., I have mixed feelings always about American candidates and their presidents, because, as I mentioned, what they say before, during the election or before presidency, it's different when they come to power, because, as I mentioned, there are so many influential people and powerful people in position of power, and if you go against them, they would literally you, like what happened with JFK. I'm not an American, but because U.S. foreign policy affects me and affects the rest of the world, that's why I'm interested in this case. I think he's a serious opponent to Donald Trump, and I think if there is, if I wanna talk from a conspiracy theory perspective, the conspiracy theorist in me would say, if there are people who want to sabotage the Donald Trump's candidacy, they would push RFK to run for presidency because his anti-war rhetoric, which is probably similar to the Donald Trump rhetoric, so that Donald Trump won't be a unique candidate talking about less wars and more diplomacy. There would be another candidate from the Democratic side who is attracting these votes on the Democratic side, but not to Donald Trump. So this could be the strategy as well. I'm just raising questions, right, and arguments and theories. But if he really says, if he really does what he says he wants to do, that means we're going back to the to the era before World War II, when the United States adopted the non-interventionism concept. So, United States non-interventionism primarily refers to the foreign policy that was eventually applied by the United States between the late 18th century and first half of the 20th century, whereby it sought to avoid alliances with other nations in order to prevent itself from being drawn into wars that were not related to the direct territorial self-defense of the United States. Neutrality Neutrality and non-interventionism found support among elite and popular opinion in the United States, which varied depending on the international context and the country's interests. At times, the degree and nature of this policy was better known as isolationism, such as the interwar period. During the start of the Cold War, in the aftermath of and World War II end and the rise of the United States as a global power, its traditional foreign policy turned toward American imperialism with diplomatic and military interventionism, engaging or somehow intervening in virtually any overseas armed conflicts ever since, and concluding multiple bilateral and regional military alliances, chiefly the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Non interventionist policies have had continued support from some Americans even after World War II, mostly regarding specific armed conflicts like the Vietnam and Korean Wars or the more recent Syrian civil war. So, if he adopts what he says he's going to do, this is going to be the situation in the United States. And this would be in the interest of everyone. And this will decrease the tensions all around the world. And I truly hope that he does this. But what do you think, guys? What do you think, first of all, about the RFK? Are you a Democrat, a Republican, or an independent, or you don't vote at all? And will you participate in the 2024 elections? And if yes, who are you going to vote and why? And what do you think about Robert F. Kennedy's Jr.'s candidacy? Do you think he will make a change? Do you think he can make a change? He can pursue the policies that he wants to pursue? I'm not sure about that. But most of you are from the United States watching my channel, so let me know your opinion in the comments below. I've been your host, Kyo Kalmasian of Syriana Analysis. If you're new, please subscribe, hit the like button, and also share this video with your friends because, as I mentioned, my channel is being suppressed now by YouTube. And if you want to support my independent work, please become a patron. Link in the description below, and see you next time.